Ayimpunchay, buen día, hello, good afternoon, bienvenidos, bienvenidas. Welcome to the Quechua Alliance 6th Annual Edition. Bienvenidos a la sexta edición del Quechua Alliance. Este es un encuentro que todos los años reúne a diferentes hablantes de quechua, educadores, profesores, activistas. This is a gathering that every year counts with Quechua speakers, activists, scholars, learners, and enthusiasts. The goal is to build up a community and to build up an intergenerational community. And that's what we've been very happy and proud to host and promote here in the United States. Cada año viene gente de diferentes partes de Estados Unidos. Este es un encuentro que promueve la generación de una comunidad que reclama el quechua más allá de sus fronteras tradicionales. Y antes de dar inicio al primer panel, queremos también reconocer y agradecer. Estamos en diferentes lugares. Generalmente en un lugar daríamos agradecimiento a la tierra y el territorio de los pueblos indígenas. Before we start, we just want to acknowledge, give a land acknowledgement. We are in different places. And usually we would gather in a specific place, we would acknowledge the specific indigenous territory. But since we are in different places, it's just a reminder that wherever we are standing on indigenous land, and we are grateful, and it's important to recognize the different heritages from different indigenous communities across the United States, but also across the world. Ahora, este evento ha sido realizado gracias a la colaboración de diferentes personas, a un equipo de voluntarios, a los participantes, por ejemplo, a las participantes de este panel. Y estamos muy agradecidos por todas las personas, a ustedes por participar. Su presencia le da relevancia a este evento. We want to be thankful to all the volunteers, the participants, and you for joining us today, because it's because of your interest that we can also build up a community, even a virtual community. Y algo que también es muy importante es que hemos contado este año con el apoyo del Centro de Estudios Latinoamericanos de la Universidad de California en Berkeley, que generosamente ha auspiciado este evento y que nos sentimos muy honrados de que sea parte de nuestra comunidad. And we also count this year with the support of the Center for Latin American Studies at the University of California, Berkeley, who has offered a generous support, and we are very happy that is part of this community. I'm going to pass it on Janet Waggaman from this center, who will also offer us some opening remarks and greetings. So thank you. Gracias, Janet.
Gracias, Américo. Thank you. Hello and welcome to the 6th Annual Quechua Alliance meeting, co-sponsored by the Center for Latin American Studies at UC Berkeley and the Quechua Alliance. I am Janet Waggaman, the Program Coordinator at the Center for Latin American Studies, which serves as the heart of Latin American Studies at Berkeley and the Bay Area. I'm happy and proud to be here today and have the opportunity to open this year's Quechua Alliance meeting. In light of the COVID-19 crisis, as America mentioned, we decided to host this gathering virtually as an opportunity to continue strengthening the vibrant Quechua enthusiast community in the United States and the diaspora despite the current circumstances. Class is pleased to be part of this vibrant space to exchange ideas between Quechua speakers, community leaders, college students, and educators who share an interest and passion for the Quechua language and the Andean culture. As with every great event, this one has many people who have worked behind the scenes to make it come to life and offer you 2 days of full learning and fun activities around Quechua. We hope you enjoy them as much as we did planning them. Hola y bienvenidos a la 6ª reunión anual de la Alianza Quechua, copatrocinada por el Centro de Estudios Latinoamericanos de la Universidad de Berkeley, en California, y la Alianza Quechua. Soy Janet Waggaman, la coordinadora de programas del Centro de Estudios Latinoamericanos, conocido como CLAS también, el cual sirve como corazón de los estudios latinoamericanos en Berkeley y el área de la Bahía. Estoy muy feliz y orgullosa de estar aquí con ustedes y tener la oportunidad de inaugurar esta reunión de la Alianza Quechua de este año. Debido al COVID-19, decidimos realizar este encuentro virtualmente como una oportunidad para continuar fortaleciendo la vibrante comunidad de entusiastas del quechua en los Estados Unidos y la diáspora, a pesar de las circunstancias actuales. CLAS se complace en ser parte de este espacio vibrante para intercambiar ideas entre hablantes de quechua, líderes comunitarios, estudiantes universitarios y educadores que comparten un interés y pasión por el idioma quechua y la cultura andina. Como ocurre con todo gran evento, este tiene muchas personas que han trabajado entre bastidores para hacerlo realidad y ofrecerles un fin de semana lleno de aprendizajes y actividades divertidos en torno al quechua. Esperamos que lo disfruten tanto como nosotros disfrutamos organizándolo para ustedes.
Muchísimas gracias, Janet. Thank you very much, Janet. And now we are going to hand this first activity, the first Quechua showcase, this opportunity to learn about different initiatives on education and promotion of Quechua. And today's moderator for this first panel will be Candy Hurtado from the Quechua Foundation in Miami, Florida. Ayinyachu Panichai, Candy. Welcome.
Ayinyachu para todos. Welcome to the Quechua Alliance Day 1 again. Las presentaciones en este panel serán todas en inglés, entonces nos vamos a mantener en inglés por ahora. So all the presentations are going to be in English, so we're going to remain in the English language in this panel. This is panel 1 of the Quechua Showcase. These are interactive presentations that are focused on education and the promotion of Quechua. Like Américo said kindly, my name is Candy Hurtado. I am the executive director of the Quechua Foundation, and I will be moderating this session. To the panelists, each presentation is going to last 10 minutes, please. I will try to remind you kindly, but I might step in and tell you at once you're running out of time. If you could please send to all the viewers your questions via Q&A. There's a Q&A button here on Zoom that you can find, and you can submit your questions there. However, all the questions will be reviewed once all of the presentations finish. So we will start with the first panel, which is introducing Ayni, a beginner-level Southern Quechua textbook. And this will be presented by Alana DeLoge, Marilyn Manley, and Carlos Molina-Vital. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Candy. Well, let's begin. We need to cover some things about this new textbook that my colleagues are developing within the United States. And the name is Ayni, and it's part of the Quechua Innovation and Teaching Initiative from the University of Illinois, and also working with Rowan University, the University of Pittsburgh, the University of Pennsylvania, and other collaborators along, the 3 times that we've met together. So give me just one sec. Good. So Alana DeLoge is not going to be with us today, but Marilyn and I will try to convey the whole point across. The general structure of the text that we're proposing came from a couple of meetings that we had with other Quechua instructors here in the United States. Both took place at the University of Illinois, while the second one online due to COVID happened on March. So you imagine that that was a time in which this needed to happen online. And the point that we're going to be focusing on right now is this particular type of activities, an activity that contextualizes the use of grammar within a communicative context. And as you can see, the textbook is in some way fairly attached to the style of the communicative method with dialogues, vocabulary, and grammar, but all of them have an objective, that is to incorporate Quechua culture from a pan-Andean perspective. That is, that we are concerned about the way in which Quechua students can learn or can get an appreciation for a whole overview of the Quechua communities, not only in Andean communities in Cusco or Ayacucho or Bolivia, but also those that are in the diaspora in the United States, or Quechua speakers who are heritage speakers or whose families' histories ended up moving to Lima or to other big cities in Andean nations or in the United States, why not? The point here is that for chapter 6, which is the unit or the chapter that we're going to focus on today, is that the main cultural topic are textiles and how people dress and the style of dressing. And that brings us, this could lend itself to put together other type of grammatical constructions, such as the middle voice or the reflexive suffix ku to indicate that you're doing something to yourself, but also the possibility of making lists of things to add up things that you can do. First you do this, and then you do that, and then you do this. So in that way, we are approaching the end of the first semester of Quechua instruction, beginner Quechua, and this activity that we're going to share with you shows how we could insert these during the development or classes towards the end of the semester. And Marilyn can continue.
Hey, Ayancho Tatimamakuna, thank you very much, Carlos. We're going to now turn to taking a look at a sample activity with the example of that fourth category that Carlos had highlighted for us. And so with the sample activity, this will be a contextualized activity that incorporates vocabulary and grammar that would be targeted within the chapter 6 that would come at the end of a first semester of Quechua language. And so within that, the students will be recycling previously learned content, communicating with each other in order to create their responses. And so in this case, we are focusing on textiles and dressing and some particular clothing items as well. So the interactive aspect will come at the end. So we will be asking for your feedback on this activity. And so the context here is an Andean clothing gift exchange. So for example, in June, your professor wants to organize an Andean clothing gift exchange for the class to celebrate Inti Raymi, sun festivities celebrated in Ecuador, Peru, and Bolivia. And so this is designed as a partner activity. We want to also stress that this is a kind of frame for an activity that could be adapted to other kinds of examples. And also, as Carlos had mentioned, our aim is to focus on Southern Quechua, but not just in the Andes, but throughout the world, and in both rural and urban types of environments where there can be syncretism of cultures as well. Also, the idea of exchange is basic to Andean culture as well. But in this case, it would be possible to adapt the activity and incorporate, change this to a Christmas gift exchange or to celebrate some other kind of event as well. And so the first step here would be to discover your partner's preferences. And Carlos will continue to tell us about this.
Absolutely. So the idea is pretty much to ask about their favorite colors, which is one of the topics that is closely related to Andean clothing. So that you can ask about like Achikilimpikuna, Chahinaliatak Chura, White, Kuka, Helio, Willapi. Willapi is a term for orange that is used in Bolivia, but you could use other terms that are used in the regions. There is widespread variation for that. So the core color terms are shared, that's for sure. Lakha, Limpikuna, like Yana, Ancas, Omer, and Chumpi. So since we're focusing on Southern Quechua, we're trying to keep the terms as close to the general use of this language.
Great. And so the students would also need to ask about their three favorite types of clothing items. And so we have examples here taken from a particular website that could be used. So Punchukuna, Lihiakuna, Chuspakuna, Chuyukuna, Chipanakuna, Ujanra, or Kunkagina, for example. And Carlos?
Yeah, and then it is possible to also ask about how frequently they wear those clothes, because that's another grammatical topic that we are pushing towards the end of the first semester. So you have a scale of frequency that goes from uñaita, always, sapap unchao, each day, every day, pasajpas, or icha pasajpis, which is used in Cusco and Bolivia, that alternation past piece, wakinkuti, sometimes, mainimpi, once in a while, hukuti, once, or maina haikajpas, or maina haikajpis, never.
Okay, so we have an example of how to carry out the step one. So for example, Maiken Yap'iqa stawa muna kunki.
Pukatawan ang kastawa na stawa muna kuni, o icha pukata ang kasta ima stawa muna kuni.
Maiken antismantap achata stawa muna kunki.
Chipanakunata, punchukunata, chuspakunata pas ima stawa muna kuni.
Haik akutita chipanakunata churakunki. Icha chipanakunawang achalikunki.
May nimpi chipanakunata churakunim. And that's an example of how we can give a model for the interaction the students are elicited.
And so the students could, so for example, use a website like Threads of Peru and go shopping online. And so these are some screenshots of the website, just to give you an idea. We like the organization of the way that the items are presented. So for example, you have the ponchos, you have hats, different bracelets, bags as well, just to give you a sense of the items on their particular site, but this could be adapted to include other websites as well.
Mm-hmm. And then what you can do is, with the students, the final step number 3 is to show your partner the gifts you selected and describe them or it in Southern Quechua, depending on how long you want this activity to go on for. So, in this way, for instance, kai chipanawan chuspawan, punchuan kampahmi, chipanakal pakamanta, isapakomanta, pukayo angkas niyok ima, chuspaka huchui, angkas niyohmi punchu, alpakamanta, isapakomanta, pukalimpiyohuan, saltas niyohuan, icha palyay niyohuanmi. So we are giving the instructor the option to have words such as saltas or palyay, which are like the alternative saltas in Bolivia, palyay in Cusco, and also in other Peruvian regions, or you can have alpaca, which is a more easily recognized word that is actually Quechua, or you can have paco, which is another possible term that is common, or pacocha, which are like alternatives that are used in Peru. And that's pretty much the idea of the to incorporate diversity, but also keeping it, under certain control, to put it like that.
So we know time is of the essence here. And so maybe for the question and answer session later, you will be able to give us some feedback. So we'd like to know what are your thoughts about the sample activity presented? And also what other topics and cultural contexts do you find important to present in this type of unit, keeping in mind a focus on self-care, dressing, and enumerating?
Thank you very much. I hope that we didn't run that much. Candy, how are we doing
No,
with time?
you're perfect. I send Marilyn a message and she reads them. So thank you both. I think it's a very useful activity for language acquisition. And I'm sure the audience will give you great feedback on that as well. So we're gonna move on. Thank you, Carlos and Marilyn again, to Chad House. I'm sorry.
Oh.
Tell me, please, Chad, how do I pronounce your last name?
It's Howe, but
Howe. All right, thank you, Chad Howe, for your presentation, which is Corpus Tools for Quechua Studies, NLP for Low Resource Languages. Thanks.
Okay, so I appreciate the opportunity to talk about this. This is a fairly new project we've started that deals with creating a Quechua corpus that's accessible, that's broadly accessible. In general, when we talk about corpora of when we talk about digital resources, it's important that we recognize that back in 2004, there were people already talking about what they call the global digital divide. That as as digital resources became more widely available, there were places that weren't equally represented. So in this case, We saw, for example, what Chin and Fairley referred to as uneven, or described as uneven access to information, uneven participation, and the decline in linguistic and cultural diversity. Now, we can talk about whether 15 years on since this claim, this has all happened, but the fact of the matter is what we find is that in terms of the resources that are available digitally and available on the internet, there is a wide discrepancy between among languages. And that particular divide is what others have referred to as the linguistic digital divide. That is, as Gesser argues, this can be viewed as, quote, the relative advantage of certain languages and language communities over others with respect to information and communication technologies. And I'll give you a more glaring example of what I mean by that. But in general, what we're trying to do with this project that I'll introduce here in a second is get at a way that Quechua might contribute to addressing this issue. And again, this linguistic digital divide really referred to what information is available on the internet, particularly the availability of digital tools. Now, we can look in Latin America in general and look at corpora that are available, and particularly large corpora, and say, well, there is a representation. So if we look at dominant languages like Spanish, for example, there are several corpora, and then I just list 3 here. And I list Spanish here just because the size of these corpora are mind-bogglingly large. Some of them, I mean, the Corpus del Español has over 2 billion words. The Sketch Engine has 9.6 billion words. These are very, very large corpora. Portuguese, again, just mentioning corpora that are available in the Latin American context, also has some fairly large sets of documents that are available. So the Tico Brahe Pars Corpus of Historical Portuguese is quite large. The Corpus de Português, both which is produced by the same team that has produced the Corpus del Español, are quite large. And then finally Sketch Engine as well, which has a very large set of data from Portuguese. If we compare that, however, with what's available for the many, many languages that are spoken, indigenous languages that are spoken in Latin America, we find a much different picture. So in that case, we find, so Guarani, for example, I'm only mentioning a few, and this is not, of course, an exhaustive list, but it's pretty close. That is, we wouldn't take long for us to create an exhaustive list. So there's a nice corpus called the Guarani Spanish Parallel Corpus. I'll talk about what that means in a second. That has fewer than 1 million tokens, in fact, about 250,000 tokens. The Axolotl, which is a web accessible parallel corpus of Spanish and Nahuatl. This is a really nice corpus, by the way, if you're interested, but it has 1.2 million words. And then the Archive of the Indigenous Languages of Latin America, which is really a large, just sort of unvetted, not unvetted, but sometimes difficult to maneuver through set of documents, though it is quite useful. And if you've ever used it for teaching or research, I highly recommend it. That said, there aren't very many tools that are available to work with those data. So for Quechua, despite being one of the largest of the language families, indigenous language families spoken in Latin America, Quechua, there's quite a scarceness of corpora and language technologies related to Quechua. There are some exceptions. So the Gelman Quechua corpus, this is produced by Professor Gelman. It's related to parent and child conversations. These are transcriptions of her research. The Leipzig corpus, which is a very, very small corpus, but is still available publicly. The LAC corpus from the Max Planck Institute, which is also not very large, but it's still available. And then the Quechua Real Words corpus. If you've never used this corpus, this is also from researchers BYU and the University of Arizona. I highly recommend it. It's quite a good corpus. That said, none of them are very large, and none of them have a wide array of tools or digital tools that you can use. And then finally, the Sequoia corpus, which is sort of our point of departure for this project, and we'll come back to that corpus later. Now, there's some challenges in working with these languages, with these natural language processing tools, which are typically used with languages like English and Spanish and Romance languages. And many of these languages in North America tend to have a high degree of morphological synthesis, so that complicates the process of natural language processing, or it can at least. Another linguistic phenomenon is tone. Tone is found in some of these languages. Not so much. We don't really have that issue in Quechua, but we can talk about how that might be addressed. And then finally, the Native Americas languages of the Americas, that is Quechua included in that, and that said, have a limited digital text production. In some cases, they may, these are quotes from Mager et al. In some cases, they may have a strong oral tradition. Now, this is not an impediment to creating a corpus. It's just one of the additional considerations you have to create. So I guess all of that is to say, as I've been rattling on, you can see that I can make this available on my website if you'd like, is that we're starting this project, or we have started this project that we don't have a nice name for yet. We're just calling it roughly the UGA Quechua Corpus Project. And our first objective is to provide broad internet-based access to Quechua language materials. Now, this would include, or will include eventually, both written and spoken transcriptions from native and non-native speakers. I'll come back to the non-native part in a minute. And then the development of NLP, or natural language processing tools. This would include what are called lemmatizers, that is, allow us to search over different manifestations of words, taggers, which would tell us about what words do in those sentences, and then parsers, which would tell us how to make sentences out of groups of words. And then we would like eventually to apply those tools to certain domains like language documentation, computer-assisted language learning, and then, if possible, some sort of machine translation. So regarding the first one, we've already started with looking at freely available materials. So we've taken, for example, the Quechua, there are several Quechua translations of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Here's the preamble, by the way, if you've never seen this. They're available online. There are several translations in different varieties of Quechua. I highly recommend looking through them if you haven't. And so the first pass would just to start getting our tools to work and make sure they work in the way that we want them to, would be to take these materials that have been used by other projects before and make sure they work with these data. So the second would be to find some historical text, and we're working with a few people to find historical text. So on Ollantay, these are mostly historical dramas that were written into Quechua, or translated into Quechua, or written and translated into Spanish. Translated short stories. So, for example, there's a nice set of short stories by Johnny Payne, or really collected and translated by Johnny Payne, called Cuentos Cusqueños. And then finally, transcribed audio selections. Ideally, we would start with the audio selections, but in terms of setting up our tools for natural language processing, we would be starting with the written documents first, just to make sure that the tools we're developing that they work. Our second objective is to develop these actual tools. One is what's called a parallel corpus. So this would be having a text in Quechua and a text in Spanish, and you would be able to view different selections of those texts together. We could also add other translations, that is, we might add an English translation, but at this point, we're just working with Spanish and English, or sorry, Quechua and Spanish. Some amount of lexical annotation, that is, if we have a word like alco and we tag that as a noun, we might also want to find other instances of the word alco, like alcocuna, and some of the context, and also make sure that those are all grouped together. So the tools we develop need to be capable of capturing that, in addition to other things like orthographic variation, which is also, as you all know, quite difficult to wrangle in Quechua. Some morphological annotation. This has been the tricky part, and we haven't gotten into that yet, but suggestions are certainly welcome. Parsing, just being able to create structural representations of the sentences in our corpus, and then finally creating an actual toolkit that users can apply. So this is the same example from the Declaration of Universal Rights. So this would be the Quechua on the left, and we might align that. That is, if you look for this, for example, in the corpus, you would then find the Spanish on the other side. Oh. That's my clock telling me to stop.
Yes, thank you. Thank you to your clock, Chad, but you can have an extra minute if you want to wrap up.
Yeah. So, and just to wrap up, we have a few priorities, and I want to point these out really quickly. Just we would like to make this as easy to use as possible. We want to find representative text, and most importantly, we would like to involve native speakers and underrepresented members of the community in the development of actually teaching some of these computational techniques in situ, in sites where we can get help gathering the data. I'm going to skip this part. But I would like to point out that you all are invited to submit abstracts. This is a plug for the Third International Symposium on Indigenous Languages. So please send your abstracts as well. Thanks.
Thank you, Chad and Chata Sulpaiki. So we wanted to move on. The next presentation will actually be in Quechua. And but the slides, however, are going to be presented fully in English. So we just wanted to give you a heads up on that. And it is entitled Incorporated Nouns in South Bolivian Quechua. And I believe Noemy Condori will present. And we also have Gabriel Gallinate and Yovana Gabriel. Thank you very much.
Gracias. Imaynaya kashankichi sumaq uncha rankunapaq kachu. Kuna noqayku ancha kusisqa kashayku kaypi kasisqaykumanta. Kuna noqayku astawanpis parlarisqayku kay Incorporated Nouns in South Bolivian Quechua nisqamanta. Kay investigación pe noqayku llank'arirqayku licenciada Noemy Condori, licenciado Gabriel Gallinate, noqa ima. Qallarisayku. Doña Ana, chay qharich alpa Sabina kutimuyasqañataq ninmi. Chay algun aysarisqacha kutimunqa. Chay runtusu algunwa. Aria. Kunanqa licenciada Yovana astawan kay investigación manta parlarisunqacha. Kay investigación pa noqayku kay 15 objetivos niyuq karqayku. Chantapis kay investigación nikupas noqayku kay Quechua sureñoan llank'arirqayku. Bolivia perqa kay Quechua sureñoqa parlarikun kay Potosi llaqtapi, Chuquisacapi, Cochabambapi, Oruro ladupi ima. Chantapis kay Quechua sureñoqa astawanpis chinkaq hina kashan. Imaraykuchus pisimanta pisi kay Quechuayata parlaqkuna chinkapushanku. Kay llaqtakunamantaqa noqayku iskay llaqtawan llank'arirqayku kay Bolivia suyumanta. Cochabambawan, Potosiwan. Cochabamba llaqtapi noqayku llank'arqayku kay Sapilica aylluwan, Challwamayu aylluwan. Potosi llaqtapitaq Norte Potosipi llank'arirqayku kay Patipati aylluwan. Chantapis kay investigación nikmanta hinallamantataq llank'arqayku iskay metodosa. Kay ñawpaq kasha dynamic interviews nisqa. Kaypaqa noqayku allinta corpus nikuta uqharinaykupaq imatachus mas k'asharqayku chaymanta noqayku kay ayllus kama chimparirqayku. Astawanpis kay ayllumanta Quechua parlaqwan yanapachikuspa. Chanta uqnin kashan kay Early Station nisqa. Kaypaqta noqayku ñawpaqtaqa chiklarirqayku rimaykunata. Kay rimaykunata kay Quechuayata parlaqkunawan 15 kutita nichirqayku. Imaynatachus, por ejemplo, runtusua. Runtusua, runtusua, runtusua. Ahinamanta. Kay iskay metodosan llank'ayqa noqaykupaqa Quechua parlaqkunapaq hinaqa aswan hasa karqa. Imaraykuchus noqayku kay ayllus marispaqa Quechuallapitaq paykunawan parlarirqayku. Ahinapitaq astawan rimaykuna noqaykupaqa kay investigación nikuta ruwanaykupaq rikhurimurqa. Chayllakama kaygama kay métodos manta. Kuna licenciada Noemy astawanpis parlarisonqachis kay investigación ta ruwasqaykumanta. Gracias, licenciada. Kunanqa kay investigación manta imatachus noqayuq tarirqayku ashaymanta parlarisqa. Quechua sureño Bolivia ukhupiqa chay compounds nisqaqa manaraq allin qhawarisqachu nitaq manaraq investigasqachu. Charaykutaq noqayku yachayta munarqayku imaynataq kay ukhun. Wakin kayguna kashanku aqhawisa, phurku uya, chantataq ashka kaykunamanta kanman. Inkinasqa sutiwan suti, adjetivuwan sutiwan, verbuwan sutiwan, sutiwan verbuwan, ahina. Astawanpis kaykunaqa kankuqa adjetivos, pero chantapas kayankumantaq sutis. Diccionariopi qhawarinchik chayqa kay rimaykunaqa kay compound nisqaqa t'aqasqa qillqasqa mana rimay hinayachu. Kayman t'aqasqa qillqakun kay hina aqhawisa, t'uru uma, phurku uya. Nuqayku qhawarisqaykuman hinaqa, chay waturisqaykuman hinaqa, tarirqayku kay incorporated nouns nisqata. Imaynataq kayguna ukhunpiri. Ukhunpiqa transitive verbo, kaypi kashan suwa, verbo, chantapis kashan t'akay. Kay transitive verbo manga suti lloq'eladuman k'askayun prefijo hina. Chayta k'askayuйтawantaq rimayta urhun. Kaymantaqa lluqsinman adjetivo mana chay suti kayanmantaq. Imaynata kay lluqsin hatun rimaypi mana chay oracionpi nisunman kaypi kashan kay warmi suwawan. Qhari warmita suwan. Kayqa sujeto qhari, warmita objeto directo. Suwan verbo. Kay verbo manga kay objeto directo prefijo hina k'askayakapun chaywanta adjetivo lluqsin warmi suwa. Nigichña hina kaymanta kaman mana chay adjetivo mana chay suti kayanmanta. Chantapis qhawarisqanchikman hinaqa kay verbosqa mana infinitivopi hina ninchik kiksitunchu churanchik kaypi kashan infinitivopi suway chantapis kashan munay kay incorporated nouns piri kay yechin karbapuña suwa nispaya muna nispaya ñawpaqta kay ejempluta qhawarisqa kaypiqa nishan wasi qhawa runa pichus mana suwa yaykurbanamanta qhawan wasita ashayta wasi qhawa ninku ashayqa adjetivo kayman sustantivo k'askayun chaywanta adjetivo lluqsin chantaqa kay incorporated nouns piqa kanan tiyan verbo transitivo puni mana transitivo kaqtintaqri chay intransitivo verbo munay kaypi kashan sufijo causativo chi k'askayunan tiyan kay transitivo verbo man parananpaq chay transitivoña kaqtintaqri recién kay suti k'askayun lloq'aladuman chaywantaq suti rikhurin. Chantapis imaynata kayguna rikhurinku kaygunaqa runa mana chay uywa kayanmantaq imatapis ashka kutita ruwan mana kutiyatachu kaypi kashan algo sipi runa mikhu qhari waqachi kay kinsapiqa kay ta qhawarisqa algo sipiqa runa alguta ña sipi ñawaq alguta sipiyanñataq ñawaq alguta sipiyanñataq mana kutiyatachu ashka kutita ashay ashka kutita ruwaqtintaq chay huchanmanta algo sipi nichikun ahinamanta kay incorporated nouns rikhurin chantaqa kay prosodiata qhawarisqaykuman hinaqa nuqayku rikurqayku quechuapiqa palabras simples nisqaqa acentuación man hinaqa kanku graves kaykunaqa kikiyantaq kanku kay rimayta qhawarisqan t'anta chay t'antapiqa kay qhepa kaq t'an aswan nishu ta aswan allistuwan entonces kay acentuación man hinaqa grave imaynataq kay incorporated nouns kanku kikisituyantaq kay azul puntitos ta qhawarisqtinchisqa kayqa acentuación kay q'illu kaqtaqri intensidad kay rimaypi qhari wisch'u nishan kaypiqa mayqantaq aswan patapi kashan acentuaciónpis intensidadpis wisch'u ashaypi aswan nishu kashan aswan patapi entonces prosodianpiqa kikisitun chay palabras simples graves nisqayataq kanku kunan imaynata qillqasqa kanku paykunaqa t'aqasqa qillqasqa kanku kunan kamapis pero nuqayku qhawarisqaykuman hinaqa khusqa qillqakunan tiyan rimay hinaya imaraykuchus kay morfosintaxis junta qhawarisqtinchisqa paykunaqa hinaya llank'anku mana iskay rimay hinachu chantapis kay iskay rimay tanta yukuqtinku junio yukuqtinku t'inki na yukuqtinkuqa waq significaduta urhunku Ajinayatata wakiningui kay proceso manta verbo yusin. Noga ujawarisqaygu imaginaga hasta wampis adjetivos yusingo. Kayangutaj pero sutis.
Noemy and Yovana, we have 2 more minutes. Dos minutos más para que acaben, por favor.
Ya. Prosodianta jawarisqaygu imaginatajri acentuación grave. Charaygutaq noqaygu jawarisqaygu imaginaga kaga hinaya qillqakunan tiyan mana t'aqasqachu tantasqa. Noqaygu kay pisi imasyawan k'askarimuyku qayyarimuyku anchata agradecespa manchay kusisqa kay Bolivia suyumanta qhichwamanta qhawarispa karqayku. Gracias.
Año y Noemí y Yovana, un placer escucharlas. Thank you so much for that presentation. Our final presentation for panel 1 is by Noor Al-Hashemi, and she will present Quechua Mental Health, Jap'iqa, or Losing Your Soul. Thank you so much, Noor.
Thank you, Candy. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I hope you guys can see. Imanaya suti Noor Nuga Iraq Manta Kani Ohio Piti Akuni. So my name is Noor. I'm an undergraduate at Ohio State University, and I know previously everyone's been kind of talking a bit more on linguistics. Mine is going to be sort of talking more about health disparities and the difference in access to healthcare and understanding those differences. So I'm excited. Thank you guys for allowing me a bit of your time to talk about this with you. So I think that in order to provide better healthcare to the Quechua people, providers need to understand the Quechua history, community, and cosmology. My goal isn't necessarily to speak for the Quechua community when I discuss this today, but to sort of take an approach that is a bit more scientific background oriented and talk more about what the Quechua people how healthcare providers can be better providing the Quechua people with healthcare. So the first topic is transgenerational inheritance. This is particularly how trauma is passed down from one generation to the next. So there's 2 approaches. One is epigenetics and the other is psychological. Basically what epigenetics is the study of how genes are turned on or off. So everyone has like DNA, right? But the DNA doesn't physically change over time, but which genes are turned on and which genes are turned off does change. And epigenetics studies the inheritance of that change and also what those changes are. And this example that I have is a mouse study where a mother was taken and traumatized, and then her male offsprings were mated to untraumatized females. And for about 5 generations, those epigenetic changes, so which genes were expressed as a result of the trauma, were shown for 5 generations, and then also behavioral changes, which is a bit more of the psychological approach, was shown. So granted, these are mice and they're a bit different than human, right? But this is still a really young field of study. And so what scientists are studying now is how does trauma inheritance look within people and whether this 5 generations holds true in people or not, or what does that actually look like? Psychologically, the nation, the community, the family, and the individual are all impacted by collective traumas, whether that's colonization or any other form of trauma that a group of people may feel. How does that impact the nation, the community, the family, and the individual? So the history of oppression that the Quechua people may have faced. I'm sure most of you probably are aware of this, but there's the colonization, the exploitation, whether it's of the land or labor, and the ongoing structural challenges such as stereotypes and discrimination that the Quechua people face on a day-to-day basis in their home countries. Any sort of cultural repression, so being forced to hide parts of their culture, and any ways of being forced to assimilate, as well as collective trauma such as mass sterilization or any other unfortunate circumstances that the Quechua people may have experienced. Those are all ways that trauma can embed itself within either DNA or psychologically into families. So the next thing is community. So the Quechua people have a strong ethnic identity, right? Everyone who's Quechua is proud to be Quechua, and it's a lovely thing, and you take pride in that. Then there's also collectivism, which is really important. And while epigenetics, those changes can potentially increase one's risk of disease. Collectivism, I would argue that the strong sense of community almost lowers that, in addition to being surrounded by the Andes Mountains and the nature and the just given the way that the community is structured, I think that might help lower the risk, but it's all things that science has yet to know. So lastly, I think cosmology is also very important. The concept of Pachamama, educating healthcare providers on this, educating them on the concept of like the life force and the energy, whether there's balances or imbalances within that energy, and how that energy then manifests in someone's health and how they can express that. All of these are really important in understanding traditional medicine within the Quechua community. Lastly, I have highlighted to just show how important cosmology is in the day-to-day life of a Quechua person is the term sonro versus corazon, right? So the corazon is the actual like anatomical heart, but the sonro is more of the soul and more spiritual realm. And just the fact that there's two different words for that, whereas in English sometimes we'll use them interchangeably, shows, I think, it highlights the importance that cosmology plays. So I kind of use Jap'iqa as a case study for this. It translates to temporary soul loss. And the symptoms of Jap'iqa are loss of appetite, sleeplessness, being tired a lot, and restlessness. So those are all things that within Western medicine, originally when I started learning this, resembled to me things of anxiety and depression. Who is more susceptible to Jap'iqa? Usually women and children. And while I was researching this, I found that children were at a higher risk of Jap'iqa because they haven't fully yet embraced their Quechua identity. They haven't been alive long enough in order to do so. And in order to cure Jap'iqa, it needs to be done specifically through a spiritual healer, such as a hampiri or a yatiri. And the typical way of going about this is the person who's lost their soul, either their parents or maybe like the healers themselves, they'll light incense and they'll call around they'll call for the soul, asking it to return to the owner's body. And they'll either have like an object or a piece of clothes from the person. And then the smoke while the incense is being lit sort of provides a path for the soul to come back to the body of its owner. And so I kind of want to conclude by talking about how we traditionally take a very scientific approach, and medicine specifically, I think, looks at it as solely like which pills need to be taken or what treatment plan needs to be addressed in order to cure an illness. But oftentimes, especially with indigenous cultures, their traditional medicine is sort of pushed to the side and seen as lesser than. But I think in order to provide the Quechua community with better healthcare, there's already the language barrier of people who speak only Quechua and don't speak Spanish, whereas healthcare providers may not be able to speak other than Spanish, or some, I feel like, may speak Quechua, but that language barrier is already a challenge. In addition to that, there's the cultural barrier where people who aren't understanding of the cosmology, the community, or the history that the Quechua people may have faced won't be able to provide as good of healthcare as providers who are aware of this. And so really it's about maximizing the cultural understandings in order to provide better healthcare and provide better quality of life to the Quechua people. So thank you, Pachi. I appreciate you guys giving me your time today.
Thank you, Noor. Very much ahead of time. So thank you. Everybody actually was right on point on your times. I wanted to thank everybody for such an enriching panel. I think it was also very diverse. And we're going to just go back to one of the questions on the Q&A. It was for Carlos and Marilyn's panel. Everybody's had just in general great comments from the audience. This was made by Robbie, and Carlos partially answered it on text, but I wanted him to give him the chance to do it live, as well as Marilyn. So Robbie says, in my experience in context of Indigenous language learning teaching, it often seems to me that no matter how well designed the teaching materials are, the class ends up being run mainly in Spanish or English. I'm curious how you see this issue. Do you think it's possible to design the materials in a way that address this, or do you think it is more a question of teacher training?
I think, Marilyn, you should go ahead and answer because I did the written reply. I don't know, you got to take a look at that.
Hey, sure, definitely. I also just a minute ago added a little bit in the answer box there as well. Yeah, this is a very important issue and question. Definitely in the class time, you know, with the very little opportunity there is for instructors to spend time with their students, if they can maintain the target language at least 90% of the time, that's the ACTFL recommendation, you know, American Council on the Teaching of Foreign Languages. And within a communicative focused classroom, you do want interaction in the target language. Teacher training is also very important, so that especially at the beginner levels, at the basic level of instruction, comprehensible input is provided. So the target language that is, you know, offered to the students has to be understandable. It has to be sometimes simplified, and there are different ways to make that input comprehensible. In this particular example that we shared, this was supposed to occur at the end of the first semester of Quechua language instruction. And so with the level of Quechua, you know, that the students have, the instructions, you know, would appear in English, but then the activity itself should be carried out in the target language during class time. I don't know if Carlos, you want to add anything else?
Just to say that, you know, the idea of a text that is open access allows for more flexibility in the way the instructors are going to use it. So even if you have instructors who are not quite, for any particular reason, as confident or comfortable doing this, you know, in the target language, the textbook will offer both Quechua and English options. And then in the future, you know, when we have a Spanish Quechua version, we'll do the same thing. So it's in the end a tool that the instructor can use at their own capabilities and within their own experience and what they feel comfortable with. Thank you.
Thank you both. So we're going to end with this question posed by Marilyn Rosas, and this was for Noor's presentation. It has just left my screen. Apologies for that. Yes, okay, so for Noor, thank you for your fascinating presentation. Do you find that different generations of Quechua people have distinct notions of what trauma and how it can be addressed?
Thank you. So I would say so. Granted, I'm only an undergraduate, so I probably don't have the opinion that a professional would, but I think there's this notion of the 1,000 paper cuts, right? So if you get one paper cut, you're going to, like, it doesn't hurt very much, but it's a bit annoying, right? Versus if you have 1,000 paper cuts all over your body, you're going to bleed out, and that's severe injury, right? That's, I think, comparable to what the Quechua youth may be experiencing today, which is, you know, maybe microaggressions or small comments here and there, discrimination, stereotypes. If it happens once, it's more of a bother, but if it keeps happening over the span of your life, that's more likely to be viewed as trauma. That's probably very different than what their grandparents experienced, which is like oppressive governments, because that sort of trauma looks very different. And to each trauma is still credible in its own regard, but it's the way that it's then gone about afterwards in the process of healing that I think can really make the impact. So I hope that answered your question.
Thank you, Noor, for that. So I just wanted to take this last minute to thank you all again for all of your presentations. They were very enriching. If there's any Q&A that stayed in the pipeline, I would welcome the presenters to go on the Q&A and answer the questions for the, but we have mostly many greetings and many thank yous from all the people listening in. So thank you again. It's been a great afternoon on my part, and I'm gonna throw it back to Américo and everybody else at class, if they are
Perfect.
still around.
Yes, thank you so much, Ayni.